It is obvious that each of you, from where you are sitting, is completely unable to see the vast size of the crowd which has gathered this afternoon. It is a true sea of humanity which stretches into the distance on both sides of the civic plaza. For us, the men of the revolutionary government, who have seen many popular gatherings, this one is so huge that it impresses us deeply and helps to show us the vast responsibility which you and we carry upon our shoulders. The people have gathered today to discuss important matters, particularly those of an international nature. But why has no one remained at home? Why has this been the largest gathering our people have held since the triumph of the revolution? Why? Because our people know what they are defending. Our people know what battle they are waging. A great struggle for their survival and triumph, and since our people are a combative and courageous people. That is why Cubans are present here. And it is said that today, when we are going to discuss the same questions as were discussed in Costa Rica, the 21 American foreign ministers are not seated here. It is very sad that they are not present, so that they could have a chance to see the people they condemned at the Costa Rica meeting. It is sad that they are not here, so they could see how different the diplomatic language of the peoples are. There, however, our foreign minister spoke on behalf of our people, but those who heard him, the majority of those who were gathered there, did not represent their peoples. If there in Costa Rica, men representing the true interests and feelings of the peoples of America, particularly the peoples of Latin America, had gathered there, never could a statement such as that issued against the interests of an American people and against the interests of all the brotherly people of America have been drafted. And what were they discussing there? There they were playing with the destiny of our country. There they were whitewashing the aggressions against our country. There they were sharpening the dagger which the criminal hand of Yankee imperialism wants to drive into the heart of the Cuban fatherland. But why do they want to condemn Cuba? What has Cuba done to be condemned? What has our people done to merit the Costa Rica Declaration? Our people have done nothing but break their chains. Our people have done nothing, harming no other people and taking nothing from any other people than to fight for a better destiny. Our people have wanted only to be free. And our people have wanted nothing to live from their own works. And our people have wanted nothing but to live from the fruits of their efforts. Our people have wanted nothing except to have what is theirs, that what is produced from their land, that what is produced with their blood, that what is produced with the sweat should be theirs. The Cuban people have only wanted the decisions guiding their conduct to be theirs, that the flag with the solitary star which flutters over our fatherland should be theirs, and theirs alone. They wanted their laws to be their own, their natural wealth to be their own, their democratic and revolutionary institutions to be their own, a fact in which no interest, no oligarchy, and no government, however powerful might be, because it has cost us much sacrifice to win it. Sovereignty must be ours and complete, because our people have been fighting for sovereignty for a century. The wealth of our land and the fruits of our labor must be ours, because our people have had to sacrifice much for this, and all that has been created by the people, and all that is here of wealth has been produced by our people, through their sweat and their labor. Our people had a right to be a true people one day. Our people had a right to govern their own destiny one day. Our people had a right to expect one day to have a government which would not defend the foreign monopolies, which would not defend the privileged interests, which would not defend the exploiters, but which would put the interests of our people and their fatherland above the interests of the greedy foreigners. A government which would put the interests of the people, the interests of the peasants, the interests of the workers, the interests of the young people and children, the interests of the women, and the old people above the interests of the privileged and the exploiters. When the revolution came to power on 1st January 1959, just a little more than a year and a half ago, what was there in our country? What was there in our fatherland with blood, tears, misery, and sweat? What was there for the peasants in our country? What was there for the children? What was there for the workers here? What was there in Cuba for the humble families? What prevailed in our fatherland until that day? The most inhumane exploitation, abuse, injustice, systematic plunder of public funds by greedy politicians had prevailed. The systematic exploitation of our national wealth by foreign monopolies, inequality and discrimination, lies and deceit, submission to foreign ambitions and poverty had prevailed. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of families lived without hope in their humble huts. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children were without schools. More than 500,000 Cubans were without work. And black Cubans had less opportunity than anyone to find work.
Yeah.
People lived in compounds. The sugarcane workers were employed only a few months a year, and they and their children suffered hunger the rest of the time. Vice, gambling, and all that goes with it prevailed in our country. The farmer was exploited. The fisherman was exploited. The worker was exploited. The vast majority of people were exploited. Nothing was ever done for the people. No measures of justice were ever undertaken to free the people from hunger, from their poverty, from their pain and suffering, to free you, the Cuban citizens, to free you, men and women, old people and children, to free you, this vast multitude which is gathered here to free the Cuban nation, to do something for it, to make something good of it. Absolutely nothing was done. And the people, helpless, had to tolerate it. The people had to pay the highest rents in the world in our fatherland. The people had to pay the highest electrical rates in the world in our fatherland. The people had to pay for telephone services as dictated by the interests of a foreign company which extracted concessions from a tyrannical government while the blood of our heroic student youth was still worn in the courtyard of the presidential palace. The monetary reserves of the nation were down to only 70 million. Our country in unequal trade with the United States had paid out $1 billion more than we had been paid for our goods in 10 years. There were no factories. Who would establish factories for the hundreds of thousands of Cubans who were without work? There were no plans for agriculture, no plans for industry. Who would concern himself with establishing industries? And the people, what could they do? What could the sugarcane workers do? What could the sugarcane farmers do? What could the worker do? The worker had only his miserable wage, the piece of bread which he could not always provide to his starving children. The profits were carried off by the foreign monopolies. The profits were accumulated by the owners. The profits were accumulated by the interest which grew fat off the labor of the people. And this money was there, they kept indefinitely in the banks or was spent in all kinds of luxury. Mainly it went abroad. Who would establish factories for the hundreds of thousands of Cubans who were without work? And as the Cuban population was growing, and as each year more than 50,000 young people came of age, what were they to live on? What was the growing population of our fatherland to live on? How were the peasants, the children of the peasants, to live on when they neither had work or land? How was people which was growing and whose growth was much more rapid than the increase in its industry and its economy supposed to live? The people lacked every kind of opportunity. The son of a peasant or of a worker or of any humble family could oddly hope to become a professional one day, a doctor, an engineer, an architect, or a university technician. There were children of poor families who, by don't have great sacrifice, managed to complete higher studies, but the vast majority of the children of our families often even lacked the opportunity to learn the letters, and there were entire regions in Cuba where they were never had a teacher. Our people had access to nothing but work, if they could find it. For our people, only the worst was available. For our people, there were never any sports fields, never any streets, never any parks, and there were many places where if there was a park, some citizens, the black ones, were not allowed.
Preach!
This was what the revolution inherited when it came to power, an economically underdeveloped country, a people which had been the victim of every kind of exploitation, which was what the revolution found at the end of its heroic and bloody struggle. And revolutions are not undertaken to leave things as they were. Revolutions are undertaken to correct all the injustices. Revolutions are not undertaken to protect and promote privileges. Revolutions are undertaken to aid those who need to be aided. Revolutions are undertaken to establish justice, to put an end to abuse, to put an end to exploitation. And a revolution was undertaken for this. And to this end, those who fall give their lives, and to achieve this goal, so many sacrifices were made. The revolution came to correct matters in our fatherland. The revolution came to do what each Cuban had been asking to have done for so long. When any helpless citizen analyzed life in our country and the picture presented by national life, he said, "This must be corrected. This needs correcting. One day this must be changed." And the more optimistic said, "One day this will be changed." To correct matters in their country, Cubans have been fighting for a long time, but there was a greater force which prevented us from correcting things in our country. This force was the imperialist penetration of the United States in our fatherland. It was this force which frustrated our full independence. It was this force which prevented Castro Garcia and his brave soldiers in Santiago de Cuba from succeeding. It was this force which prevented the Liberation Army from undertaking a revolution in the early days of the Republic. It was this force which permitted the seizure of the natural resources and the best lands of our fatherland by foreign interests. It was this force which happened. Cubans must see with full clarity that imperialism is the force to which we refer, that it is trying to prevent our people from achieving full development. They must understand that this force does not want you, the Cubans, to achieve a higher standard of living. It does not want your children educated. It does not want our workers to profit from the fruits of their labor. It does not want our peasants to enjoy the fruits of their land. It does not, in a word, want our people to be able to grow, to be able to work, and to have a better destiny. Our people have not had an opportunity in the past to understand these great truths. The truth was concealed from our people. Our people were miserably deceived. Our people were kept divided and confused. Our people have never had an opportunity to discuss these matters of an international nature. The people did not know a word of what was being said by the American ambassador to the government leaders. The people did not know a word of what the foreign ministers were saying. The people counted for nothing. The people were not gathered together to learn about their problems. The people were not gathered together to be guided or to be told the truth. The destinies of our people were decided by the U.S. foreign minister. Our people counted for nothing in the destiny of our country. Could Cuba continue to resign itself to this fate? Could Cubans continue to tolerate the system? What have the Cubans done? All they have done is to rebel against all this. All the Cubans have done is to free themselves from all this.
Woo! Will you please tell us how Cuba achieved a revolutionary victory?
Certainly. Let us begin at the time I joined the 26th of July movement in Mexico. Before the dangerous crossing of the Grama, the views on society of the members of the organization were very different. I remember in a frank discussion within our family in Mexico, I suggested we ought to propose a revolutionary program to the Cuban people. I have never forgotten how one of the participants in the attack on the Moncada army camp responded at that time. He said to me, our actions is very simple. What we want to do is to initiate a coup d'etat. Batista pulled off a coup and in only one morning took over the government. We must make another coup and expel him from power. Batista has made 100 concessions to the Americans and we will make 101. At that time I argued with him, saying that we had to make a coup on the basis of principle, and yet at the same time understand clearly what we would do after taking over the government. That was the thinking of a member of the first stage of the second 26th of July movement. Those who held the same view and did not change left a revolutionary movement later and adopted another path. From that time on, this small organization that later made the crossing on the Grama encountered repeated difficulties besides the never-ending suppression by the Mexican authorities. There was also a series of internal problems, like those people who were adventurous in the beginning but later used this pretext, and that to break away from the military expedition. Finally, at the time of the crossing on the Grana, there remained only 82 men in the organization. The adventurous thought at that time was the first and only catastrophe encountered within the organization during the process of starting the uprising. We suffered from the blow, but we gathered together again in the Sierra Maestra. For many months, the manner of our life in the mountains peaked to another in a drought without a drop of water. Merely to survive was extremely difficult. The peasants who had to endure the persecution of Batista's military units gradually began to change their attitude towards us. They fled to us for refuge to participants in our guerrilla units. In this way, our rank and file changed from city people to peasants. At that same time, as the peasants began to participate in the army struggle for freedom, of rights, and social justice, we put forth the correct slogan, I and Reform. This slogan mobilized the oppressed Cuban masses to come forward and fight to seize the land. From this time on, the first great special plan was to come forward and fight to seize the land. From this time on, the first great social plan was determined and was later became the banner and primary spearhead of our movement. It was at just this time that a tragedy occurred in Santiago de Cuba. Our comrade Frank Pai was killed. This produced a turning point in a revolutionary movement. The enraged people of Santiago, on their own, poured into the streets and called for the first politically oriented general strike. Even though the strike did not have a leader, it paralyzed the whole of Oriented province. The dictatorial government suppressed the incident. This movement, however, caused us to understand that working class participation in the struggle to achieve freedom was absolutely essential. We then began to carry out secret work among the workers in the preparation for another general strike to help the rebel army seize the government. The victorious and bold secret activities of the rebel army shook the whole country. All of the people were stirred up, leading to the general strike on April 9th last year, but the strike failed because of a lack of contact between the leaders and the working masses. Experience taught the leaders of the 26th of July movement a valuable truth. The revolution must not belong to that of our special clique. It must be undertaking of the whole body of the Cuban people. This conclusion inspired the members of the movement to work their hardest both on the plains and in the mountains. At this time, we begun to educate our forces in revolutionary theory and doctrine. This all showed that the rebel movement had already grown and was even beginning to achieve political maturity. Every person in the rebel army remembered his basic duties in the Sierra Maestra and other areas. To improve the status of the peasants, to participate in the struggle to seize land, and to build schools. Agrarian law was tried for the first time, using revolutionary methods. We confiscated the extensive positions of the officials of the dictatorial government and distributed to the peasants all of the state-held land in the area. At this time, there rose up a peasant movement closely connected to the land, with land reform as its banner. To carry out thoroughly the law providing for the abolition of the latifundia system will be the concern of the peasant masses themselves. The present state constitution provides for mandatory monetary compensation whenever land is taken away, and land reform under it will be both sluggish and difficult. Now, after the victory of the revolution, the peasants who have achieved their freedom must rise up in collective action of democratically demand the abolition of the latifundia system and the carrying out of a true and extensive land reform.
What problems does the Cuban Revolution now face, and what are its current responsibilities?
The first difficulty is that our new actions must be engaged in on the old foundations. Cuba's anti-people regime and army are already destroyed, but the dictatorial social system and economic foundations have not yet been abolished. Some of the old people are still working within the national foundations structure. When Batista fled, he cleaned out the national treasury, leaving serious difficulties in the national finances. Third, Cuba's land system is one in which latifundias hold large amounts of land, while at the same time many people are unemployed. Fourth, there's still racial discrimination in our society, which is not beneficial to efforts to achieve the internal unification of the people. Fifth, our house rents are the highest in the world. A family frequently has to pay over a third of its income for rent. To sum up, the reform of the foundations of the economy of the Cuban society is very difficult and will take a long time. In establishing the ordered society and in democratizing the national life, the new government has adopted many positive measures. We have exerted great effort to restore the national economy. For example, the government has passed a law lowering rents by 50%. Yesterday, a law regulating beaches was posted to cancel the privileges of a small number of people who occupy the land and the seashore. Most important is the land reform law, which will soon be promulgated. Moreover, we will found a national land reform institute. Our land reform here is not yet very penetrating. It is not as thorough as the one in China, yet it must be considered the most progressive in Latin America.
How will Cuba struggle against domestic and foreign reactionary enemies? What are the prospects of the revolution?
The Cuban Revolution is not a class revolution, but a liberation movement that has overthrown a dictatorial, tyrannical government. The people detested the American-supported Batista dictatorial government from the bottoms of their heart, and so rose up and overthrew it. The revolutionary government has received the broad support of all the strata of people because its economic measures have taken care of the requirements of all and have gradually improved the livelihood of the people. The only enemies remaining in the country are the latifundistas and the reactionary bourgeois. They oppose the land reform that goes against their own interests. These internal reactionary forces may get in league with the developing provocations of the foreign reactionary forces and attack the revolutionary government. The only enemies who oppose the Cuban Revolution are the people who monopolize to create some kind of dispute, and then utilize certain international organizations they control to carry out intervention against the Cuban people. We do not have fear and attack from small neighboring dictatorial country, but from a certain large country, using certain international organizations and a certain kind of pretext in order to intervene and undermine the Cuban Revolution. So after watching the other two previous skits that I just did, obviously this history presentation is about how whatever we decide to present affects Cold War. And in the first skit, I played Fidel Castro. I tried to recreate my version of his speech because for the discussion we had to interpret the difference between Fidel Castro's speech and Che Guevara's interview. And, well, I'll just begin by, like, the Cold War in general. Well, I believe the Cold War is defined as, like, pretty much the tensions between USA and the Soviet Union between a vast majority of time before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And many things contributed to the Cold War. And my presentation is about how the Cuban Revolution contributed to the Cold War. And, well, the Cuban Revolution was when the Castro overthrew Batista's tyrannical government, and Batista was a dictator, and he made Cuba's economy go down, and pretty much Fidel Castro, he was a communist revolutionary, and he was jailed, and he went in Mexico. He met Che Guevara,
and both of them were the ones that kind of were the main causes of the Cuban Revolution. So Fidel Castro, in his speech, he mentions how he doesn't support America, how America is real imperialist nations and doesn't want the imperialism to come into Cuba. He wants Cuba to be the economy to regenerate after Batista. And in his speech, he's very clever with his words, trying to get the Cuban people excited, happy, giving them a prospect for a better future. That's how I tried to recreate the speech. So the speech was pretty much just for the Cuban Revolution. And the Che Guevara interview, he kind of was more of he promoted Guevarism or Guerrillism, and that's like where he was also a communist revolutionary, and obviously since the Cold War was tensions between America and U.S. and Soviet Union. It was kind of like the Cuban Revolution, which caused Castro to be in power with the help of Guevara, of course. That made Cuba in a higher running field. So the USSR saw that Cuba was a good ally, and obviously Cuba being right next to America, being an ally with Russia, the Soviet Union would create tension between America and the Soviet Union. And of course, Fidel Castro had a hand in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's when the USSR implanted missiles in Cuba, which is obviously right next to U.S., and that's going to get them mad. And Cuba was mainly siding with the USSR. So this was all done by Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, which caused Fidel Castro to be in power in order for it to become a communist nation. And USA did not want a communist nation right next to it because it thought communism was bad, but obviously USSR was a communist nation. So that further increased the tensions between the USSR and America. So in whole, my presentation was just reiterating the speech by Fidel Castro, and I think in his speech he's pretty much denouncing, saying that America is not a good country in the way he talks. He just wants Cuba to side more with the USSR, and obviously Guevara as well. You can see more near the end of the interview how he also doesn't see America as a good ally. So both of them together caused, when they met, they caused the Cuban Revolution, got Batista out of power. Then Fidel Castro got into power. Therefore, communism was kind of becoming a thing, and that it became an ally with USSR, which angered America, and then obviously Castro had a role in the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that further angered U.S. And yeah, that's why I reiterated the speech of Castro, which I think is one of his more famous speeches, and the Guevara interview, because those two are the biggest powers in the Cuban Revolution, and that's why I believe the Cuban Revolution had a big power, which created more tension and therefore enhanced the impacts of the Cold War.